The Belo Monte Dam is a hydroelectric dam complex currently under construction on the Xingu River in the state of Pará, Brazil. The planned installed capacity of the dam complex would be 11,233 megawatts, which would make it the second largest hydroelectric dam complex in Brazil and one of the world's largest in installed capacity, behind the Three Gorges Dam in China and the Brazilian-Paraguayan Itaipu Dam. Considering the oscillations of flow river, guaranteed minimum capacity generation from the Belo Monte Dam would measure 4,571 MW, 39% of its maximum capacity. Transmission lines would connect electricity generated by the dam's turbines to the main Brazilian power grid, which would distribute it throughout the country, both for residential and commercial consumption and to supply the growth of such industries as aluminium transformation and metallurgy. Brazil's rapid economic growth over the last decade has provoked a huge demand for new and stable sources of energy, especially to supply its growing industries. In Brazil, 46% of the energy consumed comes from renewable energy sources, and hydroelectric power plants produce over 85% of the electrical energy. The government has decided to construct new hydroelectric dams to guarantee national energy security. However, there is opposition both within Brazil and among the international community to the project's potential construction regarding its economic viability, the generation efficiency of the dams and in particular its impacts on the region's people and environment. In addition, critics worry that construction of the Belo Monte Dam could make the construction of other dams upstream, which could have greater impacts, more viable. Plans for the dam began in 1975 but were soon shelved due to controversy. They were later revitalized in the late 1990s. In the 2000s, the dam was redesigned, but faced renewed controversy and impact assessments were carried out. On August 26, 2010, a contract was signed with Norte Energia to construct the dam once the Brazilian Institute of Environment and Renewable Natural Resources had issued an installation license. A partial installation license was granted on January 26, 2011 and a full license to construct the dam was issued on June 1, 2011. The licensing process and the dam's construction have been mired in federal court battles. The current ruling is that construction is allowed, because the license is based on 5 different environmental technical reports and in accordance with the RIMA study for Belo Monte. History. Plans for what would eventually be called the Belo Monte Dam complex began in 1975 during Brazil's military dictatorship, when Ultranorte contracted the Consa Cubed RCI Nacional de Engenheiros Consultores to realize a hydrographic study to locate potential sites for a hydroelectric project on the Xingu River. CNEC completed its study in 1979 and identified the possibility of constructing 5 dams on the Xingu River and 1 dam on the Iriri River. Original plans for the project based on the 1979 study included 2 dams close to Belo Monte. These were, Kararaô, Babaquara which was the next upstream. 4 other dams were planned upstream as well and they include the Ipaxuna, Cacramaro, Iriri and Jurina. The project was part of Eletrobrás 2010 plan, which included 297 dams that were to be constructed in Brazil by 2010. The plan was leaked early and officially released in December 1987 to an antagonistic public. The plan had Belo Monte to be constructed by 2000 and Altamira by 2005. Such a speedy timetable was due to the belief that Brazil's relatively new environmental regulations could not stop large projects. The government offered little transparency to the people who would be affected regarding its plans for the hydroelectric project, provoking indigenous tribes of the region to organize what they called the I Encontro das No Picavolta Micronas Indigenas do Xingu or the Altamira Gathering, in 1989. The encounter, symbolized by the indigenous woman leader Tuará holding her machete against the face of then engineer José copyright Antonio Muniz Lope sparked enormous repercussions both in Brazil and internationally over the plans for the 6 dams. As a result, the 5 dams above Belo Monte were removed from planning and Kararaô was renamed to Belo Monte at the request of the people of that tribe. Ultranorte also stated they would reserve the 4, meaning reserve the dams on the river. Redesign. Between 1989 and 2002, the Belo Monte project was redesigned. the reservoir's surface area was reduced from 1,225 km2 to 440 km2 by moving the dam further upstream. The main rationale for this was to reduce flooding of the Bakajar indigenous area. In 1998, the Babaquara Dam was again placed into planning but under a new name, the Altamira Dam. This surprised local leaders as they felt plans for the dams above Belo Monte were cancelled. Some officials in Brazil were determined to build a dam on a river with an average flow of 7,800 am3 per second and at a site that offers a 87.5 am drop. One engineer said of the dam, "God only makes a place like Belo Monte once in a while." This place was made for a decommitted president of Eletronorte, José Copyright Muniz Lopes, in an interview with the newspaper O Liberal, affirmed. Within the electric sector's planning for the period 2010-2020, we unregistered trademark re-looking at 3 dams Maraba, Altamira and Itaipu. Some journalists say that we are not talking about these dams because we unregistered trademark trying to hide them. Unregistered trademark just that their time has not yet come. We unregistered trademark now asking for authorization to intensify our studies for these dams. Brazil would be greatly benefited if we could follow Belo Monte with Maraba, then Altamira and Itaipu. Second study, in 2002, Eletronorte presented a new environmental impact assessment for the Belo Monte Dam complex, which presented 3 alternatives. Alternative A included the 6 original dams planned in 1975. Alternative B included a reduction to 4 dams, dropping Jurina and Iriri. Alternative C included a reduction to Belo Monte only. The new environmental impact assessment contained reductions in reservoir size and the introduction of a run-of-the-river model, in contrast to the large reservoirs characteristic of the 1975 plans. Also in 2002, Workers' Party leader Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva earned a victory in his campaign for president, having originally run a failed campaign in 1985 after the fall of the military dictatorship. Lula soon brokered political deals with the center and right-wing sectors in 2003, especially with ex-president José Copyright Sani of the state of Maranhão of the PMDB, which would set the precedent that eventually characterized the 2 Lula administrations: cooperation between the market and the state, a combination of a free market economy with larger social spending and welfare. This economic model provided the rationale and financial support for new efforts to construct Belo Monte. In 2007, at the beginning of Lula's second term in office, a new national investment program was introduced, the Programa de Desenvolvimento do Crescimento. The Belo Monte Dam complex figured as an anchor project of the new investment plan. In 2008, another new environmental impact assessment was written, this time by Eletrobras with the participation of Odebrecht, Camargo Correa, and Andrade Gutierrez, which formally accepted Alternative C or the construction only of the Belo Monte Dam itself. The assessment also presented further design changes. In order to avoid inundating indigenous territory, which is not permitted by the Brazilian constitution, the new design included 2 canals to divert the water away from indigenous territories and into a reservoir called the Reservatório dos Canais. An additional reservoir would be created called the Reservatório da Cala do Xingu, and electricity would be generated from the 2 reservoirs using 3 dams, a complementary powerhouse called Pimentel, a complementary spillway called Bela Vista, and the main powerhouse called Belo Monte. The Reservatório dos Canais would be retained by over a dozen large dikes, and water from the reservoirs would be channeled towards the main powerhouse. However, transparency of the government's plans once again became an issue, sparking indigenous tribes of the region to organize another large meeting, called the Segundo Encontro dos Povos do Xingu in the city of Altamira, Pará on May 20, 2008. First license granted, in February 2010. Brazilian Environmental Agency IBAMA granted a provisional environmental license, one of 3 licenses required by Brazilian legislation for development projects. The provisional license approved the 2008 environmental impact assessment and permitted the project auction to take place in April 2010. In April 2010, Odebrecht, Camargo Correa, and CPFL dropped out of the project tender, arguing that the artificially low price of the auction set by the government was not viable for economic returns on investment. On April 20, 2010, the Norte y Naja consortium won the project auction by bidding at $77.97 per MWh, almost 6% below the price ceiling of $83 per MWh. After the auction, local leaders around the project site warned of imminent violence. Kayapa Cubed leader Roni Metakataya stated, "There will be a war so the white man cannot interfere in our lands again." U.S. film director James Cameron also visited the site prior to the auction and stated he would produce an anti-Belo Monte Dam film called Message from Pandora, which was later released in November. In April 2010, the Brazilian Federal Attorney General's office suspended the project tender and annulled the provisional environmental license on claims of unconstitutionality. Specifically, Article 176 of the Federal Constitution states that federal law must determine the conditions of mineral and hydroelectric extraction when these activities take place in indigenous peoples' territories, as is the case for the Big Bend region. As a result, the electric utility ANEEL cancelled the project auction. The same day, the Appellate Court for Region 1 disenfranchised the Attorney General's suspension, reinstating the project auction at ANEEL. On August 26, 2010, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva signed the contract with the Norte y Naja at a ceremony in Brasilia. Construction was not permitted to begin on the Belo Monte Dam complex until IBAMA granted the second of the federally required environmental licenses, called the installation license. The installation license was only to be granted once Norte y Naja shows indisputable proof that it has met 40 socio-environmental mitigation conditions upon which the first provisional environmental license was conditioned. According to an October 2010 IBAMA report, at least 23 conditions had not been met. Reports indicate that on January 14, 2011, a report from staff members of FUNAI, Fundo Picavolt Pound O Nacional do and Dio, had sent a report to IBAMA expressing concerns about the location of the project, its impact on reservation land, and the lack of attention to needs of the indigenous people, especially the Pakia section number, and recommending that FUNAI oppose any license to operate. Despite this report, FUNAI senior management sent IBAMA a letter on January 21, 2011 stating that it did not oppose the issuance of a limited construction license. On January 26, 2011, a partial installation license was granted by IBAMA, authorizing Norte y Naja to begin initial construction activities only, including forest clearing, the construction of easement areas, and improvement of existing roads for the transport of equipment and machinery. In February 2011, Norte y Naja signed contracts with multiple suppliers for the design, production, installation and commissioning of generation and associated equipment. On June 1, 2011, IBAMA granted the full license to construct the dam after studies were carried out and the consortium agreed to pay $1.9 billion in costs to address social and environmental problems. The only remaining license is one to operate the dam's power plant. Federal court cases. On February 25, 2011, the federal public prosecutor filed its 11th lawsuit against Belo Monte Dam, suspending IBAMA's partial installation license, on the grounds that the Brazilian constitution does not allow for the granting of partial project licenses. The federal public prosecutor also argued that the 40 social and environmental conditions tied to IBAMA's provisional license of February 2010 had yet to be fulfilled, a prerequisite to the granting of a full installation license. On February 25, 2011, Brazilian federal judge Reinaldo Desteraro blocked the project citing environmental concerns. It was Brazil's biggest public hearing ever. The ruling was described by The Guardian as a serious setback. President of a federal regional court Orlando Menezes overturned the decision on March 3, 2011, saying there was no need for all conditions to be met in order for preliminary work to begin. Construction site preparation began with a week after the decision. On September 28, though, due to concerns for local fishers, a federal judge prohibited Norte y Naja from building a port, using explosives, installing dikes, building canals and any other infrastructure work that would interfere with the natural flow of the Xingu River, thereby affecting local fish stocks. On November 9, construction was allowed to recommence after federal judge Maria do Carmo Cardoso ruled that indigenous people did not have to be consulted by law before work approval. The ruling is expected to be appealed in the Supreme Federal Court. On April 25, 2012, a regional judge ruled an upcoming employee strike to be illegal. Workers were seeking improved payments and additional time off. However, according to the court, the contractor company did not violate its terms and as such, its employees will be fined for $200 per day if they do not attend. On August 14, 2012, work on the dam was halted by order of the Brazilian Federal Court, when federal Judge Souza Prudente halted construction on the controversial Belo Monte Dam in the Amazon, saying that the indigenous peoples had not been consulted. The Supreme Federal Court overturned the decision on August 28 and ordered construction to recommence. Design. The Belo Monte Dam is a complex of 3 dams, numerous dikes and a series of canals in order to supply 2 different power stations with water. The Pimentel Dam on the Xingu would be 36 meters tall and 6,248 meters long and have a structural volume of 4,768,000 cubic meters. It would create the Kararaô Xingu Reservoir, which would have a normal capacity of 2,069,000,000 cubic meters and surface area of 333 square kilometers. The dam would support a power station and its spillway would serve as the complex's principal spillway with 17 floodgates and a 47,400 cubic meters per second maximum discharge. The dam's reservoir would also divert water into 2 12 km long canals. These canals would supply water to the Dos Canais Reservoir, which is created within the Big Bend by the main dam, Belo Monte, a series of 28 dikes around the reservoir's perimeter, and the Bela Vista Dam, which lies on the Dos Canais Reservoir's eastern perimeter. The Belo Monte Dam would support the main power station in the complex. The power station would contain 20 vertical Francis turbines listed at 550 MW. Supplying each turbine with water is a 113-meter-long, 11.2 meters diameter penstock, affording an average of 89.3 meters of hydraulic head. The Pimentel Dam's power station would contain 7 Kaplan bulb turbines, each rated at 25.9 MW and with 13.1 meters of hydraulic head. The Belo Monte Dam would be 90 meters tall and 3,545 meters long and have a structural volume of 25,356,000 cubic meters, while the Bela Vista would be 33 meters high and 351 meters long and have a structural volume of 239,500 cubic meters. The Dos Canais Reservoir would have a normal capacity of 1,889,000,000 cubic meters, a normal surface area of 108 square kilometers and a normal elevation area of 97 meters above sea level. The Bela Vista Dam, which serves as the complex's secondary spillway, would have a maximum discharge capacity of 14,600 cubic meters per second. Power generation and distribution. The planned capacity of Belo Monte is listed at 11,233 MW. It is composed of the main Belo Monte Dam, and its turbine house with an installed capacity of 11,000 MW. The Pimentel Dam, which also includes a turbine house, would have an installed capacity of 233.1 MW, containing 25.9 MW bulb turbines. The generation facility is planned to have 20 Francis turbines with a capacity of 550 €611 MW each. In February 2011, Norte Energo signed contracts with IMPSA worth $450 a million to design and install by the fall of 2015 4 Francis turbine generation units to provide 2,500 MW of power. Andritz AG to provide 3 Francis turbines and the 6 bulb turbines, and the 14 excitation systems for the main powerhouse and additional equipment for the Pimentel powerhouse. Alstom worth $682.3 a million to provide 7 Francis turbines, and 14 gas-insulated substations for the facility. Capacity. Walter Coronado and Tunes, the former Secretary of the Environment of the state of São Paulo, and ex-president of the State Water and Sanitation Utility SABSP, has claimed that the Belo Monte Dam complex would be one of the least efficient hydropower projects in the history of Brazil, producing only 10% of its 11,233 MW nameplate capacity between July and October. According to the president of Brazil's energy research company, 39% is just a little below Brazil's average of 55%. Normally, the capacity factor of hydroelectric power plants is between 30% and 80%, while wind power is typically between 20% and 40%. According to a study by Eletrobras, even when it reduced capacities, Belo Monte would still have the capacity to supply the entire state of Pará with electricity. Availability: critics claim that the project would only make financial sense if the Brazilian government builds additional dam reservoirs upstream to guarantee a year-round flow of water, thus increasing the availability of generation. Supporters of the project point out that the seasonal minimum flow of the Xingu River occurs at a time when other Brazilian hydro plants are well supplied, so that no additional dams would have to be built. Reportedly, Brazil's National Council for Power Policies approved a resolution, previously sanctioned by then-President Lula, that only one hydroelectric dam would be built on the Xingu. With one dam, critics don't see an advantage regarding the dam's cost-to-benefit ratio and question why the government would just want to construct one. Additional upstream dams would directly and indirectly affect 25,000 indigenous peoples in the entire Xingu Basin. Of particular note is the Altamira Dam, which would flood an additional 6,140 square kilometers of reservoir, according to its original design. Developer: the project is developed by Norte Energia. The consortium is controlled by the state-owned power company Eletrobras, which directly and through its subsidiaries Eletronorte and CHESF controls a 49.98% stake in the consortium. In July 2010, the federal holding company Eletrobras stated that there were 18 partners and reported their adjusted share in the project, Eletronorte Euro 19.98%, Eletrobras, state-owned company Euro 15%, CHESF Euro 15%, Bolzano Participações Investments Fund Euro 10%, Guy Energia e Participar Picavolt Micron as Euro 9%. Caixa Fiquevics Investments Fund Euro 5%, construction firm OAS Euro 2.51%, Queiroz Galva-Poundo, construction company Euro 2.51%, Funds Pension Fund Euro 2.5%, Galva-Poundo Engenharia, construction company Euro 1.25%, Conten Construa Picavolt Micron is, construction company Euro 1.25%. Satenco Engenharia, construction company Euro 1.25%, Mendes Jr., construction company Euro 1.25%, Servan Civilson, construction company Euro 1.25%, J. Malusali, construction company Euro 1%, Sinabras Euro 1%, J. Malusali Energia, construction company Euro 0.25%. The Norte Energia consortium construction companies were reported to have originally held a 40% share. In April 2012 it was announced that a $146 million contract was signed between Norte Energia SA and a consortium consisting of Arcadia's Logos holding a 35% share, and Thamag, Concremat, and Ingecorps, who will provide their engineering services to the project. Economics: the dam complex is expected to cost upwards of $16 a billion and the transmission lines $2.5 a billion. The project is being developed by the state-owned power company Eletronorte, and would be funded largely by the Brazilian Development Bank. The project will also include substantial amounts of funding from Brazilian pension funds Petros, Previ, and Funds. Private investors interested in the project include mining giants Alco and Vale, construction conglomerates Andrade Gutierrez, Votorantim, Grupo OAS, Queiroz Galva-Poundo, Odebrecht and Camargo Correa, and energy companies GDF Suez and Neo Energia. In 2006, Conservation Strategy Fund analyzed different cost-benefit scenarios for Belo Monte as an energy project, excluding environmental costs. Initial benefits appeared marginal. When simulating energy benefits using a modeling system, it became obvious that Belo Monte would require additional upstream dams to provide water storage for dry season generation. CSF concluded that Belo Monte would not be sustainable without the proposed Altamira Dam, which would have a reservoir more than 10 times the size of Belo Monte's, flood 30 times the area submerged by Belo Monte. Indigenous territories of the Araweta copyright/Igarapa copyright Ipaxuna, Cotinamo, Arara, Kararaô, and Cacoeira Sakadu and natives. Due to the project's lack of economic viability and lack of interest from private investors, the government has had to rely on pension funds and lines of credit from BNDES that draw from the Workers' Assistance Fund, oriented towards paying the public debt, to finance the project. Up to one-third of the project's official cost would be financed by incentives using public money. Alternatives. WWF Brazil released a report in 2007 stating that Brazil could cut its expected demand for electricity by 40% by 2020 by investing in energy efficiency. The power saved would be equivalent to 14 Belo Monte hydroelectric plants and would result in national electricity savings of up to $33 a billion. Ex-director of ANEE Alfonso Henriques Moreira Santos stated that large dams such as Belo Monte were not necessary to meet the government's goal of 6% growth per year. Rather, he argued that Brazil could grow through increasing its installed capacity in wind power, currently only at 400 MW. However, a study by the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, published in June 2011, criticized some of these alternative suggestions and defended the Belo Monte Dam project. They state that compared to the estimated costs of alternative energies, the Belo Monte Dam is cheaper both in economic and in socio-environmental costs. Environmental effects. The project is strongly criticized by indigenous people and numerous environmental organizations in Brazil plus organizations and individuals around the world. Belo Monte's 668 square kilometers of reservoir will flood 400 square kilometers of forest, about 0.01% of the Amazon forest. Though argued to be a relatively small area for a dam, unregistered trademark energy output, this output cannot be fully obtained without the construction of other dams planned within the dam complex. The prognosed area of reservoir for the Belo Monte Dam and the necessary Altamira Dam together will exceed 6,500 km2 of rainforest. The environmental impact assessment written by Eletrobras, Odebrecht, Camargo Correa, and Andrade Gutierrez listed the following possible adverse effects: the loss of vegetation and natural spaces, with changes in fauna and flora. Changes in the quality and path of the water supply, and fish migration routes. Temporary disruption of the water supply in the Xingu River bed for 7 months. Incomplete environmental assessment. In February 2010, Brazilian Environmental Agency IBAMA granted an environmental license for the construction of the dam despite uproar from within the agency about incomplete information in the environmental impact assessment written by Eletrobras, Odebrecht, Camargo Correa, and Andrade Gutierrez. Previously in October 2009, a panel composed of independent experts and specialists from Brazilian universities and research institutes issued a report on the EIA, finding various omissions and methodological inconsistencies in the EIA. Among the problems cited within the EIA were the project's uncertain cost, deforestation, generation capacity, greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular the omission of consideration for those affected by the river being mostly diverted in the 100 km long Big Bend. 2 senior officials at IBAMA, Leozildo Tabajara da Silva Benjamin and Sebastião Pound o Costa Cube do Pias, resigned their posts in 2009 citing high-level political pressure to approve the project. In January 2011, IBAMA President Abelardo Azevedo also resigned his post. The previous president Roberto Messias had also stepped down, citing in April 2010 that it was because of pressure from both the government and environmental organizations. 140 organizations and movements from Brazil and across the globe decried the decision-making process in granting the environmental license for the dams in a letter to Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in 2010. Loss of biodiversity. The fish fauna of the Xingu River is extremely rich with an estimated 600 fish species and with a high degree of endemism, with many species found nowhere else in the world. The area either dried out or drowned by the dam spans the entire known world distribution of a number of species, for example the zebra pleco, the sunshine pleco, the slender dwarf pike cichlid, the plant-eating Piranha-Satus xinguense and the Xingu dart poison frog. An independent expert review of the costs of the dam concluded that the proposed flow through the Volta Grande meant the river will not be capable of maintaining species diversity, risking extinction of hundreds of species. Greenhouse gas budget. The National Amazon Research Institute calculated that during its first 10 years, the Belo Monte Dam complex would emit 11.2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and an additional 0.783 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent would be generated during construction and connection to the national energy grid. This independent study estimates greenhouse gas emissions of an amount that would require 41 years of optimal energy production from the Belo Monte Dam complex in order to reach environmental sustainability over fossil fuel energy. Dams in Brazil emit high amounts of methane, due to the lush jungle covered by waters each year as the basin fills. Carbon is trapped by foliage, which then decays anaerobically with help from methanogens, converting the carbon to methane, which is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. As a result, carbon emissions are emitted from the dam each year it is in operation. A 1990 study of the Kararaô Dam, also in Brazil, found that it pollutes 3.5 times more in carbon dioxide equivalent than an oil power plant generating an equal amount of electricity would. Not in the form of the CO2 atmospheric pollution associated with fossil fuel burning, but as the more dangerous methane emissions. Furthermore, the forest will be cleared before flooding of the area, so the CO2 and methane emissions calculated for the flooding of the forested area will be significantly undercut. In addition, a study on the Brazilian-Paraguayan Dam showed that the actual greenhouse gas emissions were a factor 10 higher than its official calculations showed, and this dam is no exception. It is feared that the Belo Monte Dam calculations are also deliberately undercutting reality and that the flooding of its reservoir will create a similar situation. If the dam builders cleared the forest beforehand, they would remove the organic matter from the reservoir floor and the dam would produce less of the greenhouse gas methane. However, in the case of Tucuruá, only the economically necessary forest was cut and the rest was left intact to be flooded by the reservoir. The contractors has sold the logging rights to the flooded area, but found the plot unviable in the short amount of time they had allocated before the area was set to be flooded. This forest has been decaying under the water through methanogenesis and producing large amounts of greenhouse gases. On the other hand, the energy generated by the dam for the next 50 years, at an average of 4419 MW, is 1.14 BBOE. This is approximately 9% of the proven oil reserves of Brazil, or 2% of the total oil reserves of Russia, or 5.5% of the proven oil reserves of the U.S. Social effects. Although strongly criticized by indigenous leaders, the president of Brazil's EPE claims they have popular support for the dam. On April 20, 2010, followed a São Paulo poll showed 52% in favor of the dam. The dam will directly displace over 20,000 people, mainly from the municipalities of Altamira and Vita Cubed Rio do Xingu. Two river diversion canals 500 meters wide by 12 kilometers long will be excavated. The canals would divert water from the main dam to the power plant. Belo Monte will flood a total area of 668 square kilometers. Of the total, 400 square kilometers of flooded area will be forested land. The river diversion canals will reduce river flow by 80% in the area known as the Volta Grande, where the territories of the indigenous Juruna and Arara people, as well as those of 16 other ethnic groups are located. While these tribes will not be directly impacted by reservoir flooding, and therefore will not be relocated, they may suffer involuntary displacement, as the river diversion negatively affects their fisheries, groundwater, ability to transport on the river, and stagnant pools of water offer an environment for waterborne diseases, an issue that is criticized for not being addressed in the environmental impact assessment. Among the 20,000 to be directly displaced by reservoir flooding, resettlement programs have been identified by the government as necessary for mitigation. Norte Naja have failed to obtain free, prior, and informed consent from the Juruna and Arara indigenous tribes to be impacted by Belo Monte. The project would also attract an estimated 100,000 migrants to the area. An estimated 18,700 direct jobs would be created, with an additional 25,000 indirect jobs to accommodate the surge in population. However, only a fraction of the direct jobs will stay available after the projected unregistered trademark's completion, which critics have argued to spell economic disaster rather than economic prosperity. The influx of immigrants and construction workers has also led to increased social tension between groups. Indigenous groups report attacks and harassment, and in several occasions the destruction of property and the death of indigenous persons as a result from constructing and logging activities. External researchers indicate that the majority of the Belo Monte Dam unregistered trademark's energy output will be relegated towards the aluminium industry, and will not benefit the people living in the area. However, Norte Naja released a clarification note stating their concern with the socio-economic development of the area, including the promise to invest a $3.700 billion into various issues. IBAMA report: the IBAMA's environmental impact assessment has listed the following possible impacts: the generation of expectations towards the future of the local population and indigenous people, an increase in population and uncontrolled land occupation, an increase in the needs of services and goods, as well as job demand, a loss of housing and economic activities due to the transfer of population, improvements on the accessibility of the region, changes in the landscape, caused by the installation of support and main structures for the construction of the dam, damage to the archaeological estates in the area, permanent flooding of shelters in Gravura Assuranai. However, a clarification was released by the Brazilian authorities, in which it was deemed that the assured social and economic benefits, considered for the environmental redesign and the region unregistered trademark's infrastructural developments, would outweigh the prognosed environmental damage. Since the beginning of the project, many environmental and human rights organizations have been protesting against the construction of the Belo Monte Dam, for example, AVAS, Rainforest Rescue, Amazon Watch. On 14 August the Brazil Federal Court halted the construction of the Belo Monte Dam on the basis that the government's authorization of the dam was unconstitutional. The government didn't hold constitutionally required meetings with indigenous communities affected by the dam before granting permission in 2005 to start with the construction. This is against the Brazilian law and international human rights. However, Norte Naja, the company assigned with the construction of the Belo Monte Dam, has the possibility of an appeal to the Supreme Court. Human rights concerns: the attitude and treatment of the Brazilian government towards the affected indigenous groups is strongly criticized internationally. The Union Human Rights Council has published statements denouncing Brazil unregistered trademark's careless constructing, and the International Labour Organization likewise pointed out that the Brazilian state was in violation of ILO conventions although mechanisms for international enforcement are lacking, and it would require a Brazilian court to apply the binding principles of the convention, which Brazil has ratified. Indigenous groups have questioned the governmental unregistered trademark's actions over these events, but their situation remains ignored by the authorities, as shown with the May 2011 Xingu Mission report of the CDDPH, of which several sections regarding accusations of human rights violations were excluded by the Special Secretary for Human Rights, Maria do Rosa Rio Nunes. See also: Cost of electricity by source, Energy policy of Brazil, Electricity sector in Brazil, Hydroelectricity, Intermittent energy source, List of power stations in Brazil, Chief Rony, Notes. References article from Social Status on the comparisons on how we view news in different mediums in reference to the Chief Roni, Belo Monte Dam image http, Rhiannon-Bivan WordPress.com 04 News vs News / external links, Belo Monte Hydroelectric Complex, AHE Belo Monte at Eletrobras, Belo Monte Campaign at International Rivers, Belo Monte Dam at Amazon Watch, documentary, Belo Monte Backgrounder, The Rights and Wrongs of Belo Monte May 4, 2013 The Economist, Pontiroli Gobbi, Francesco. Brazil's Belo Monte Dam project. Financial impact, indigenous peoples' rights and the environment. Library briefing. Library of the European Parliament. Retrieved June 20, 2013 Building Belo Monte, a photographic documentary series.